Today I want to give you a quick overview of U.S. history using this timeline of U.S. history chart. In particular, I'm going to be using these maps on the far right, which show how the territory that we now call the United States evolved over the last 400 years or so. There are 10 maps in total, and the time difference between each one is exactly 40 years. So by looking at each one in turn, we can get a general idea of how U.S. history unfolded. But before we do that, let me quickly show you the other parts of this chart. On the far left, we have the monarchs of England and later Great Britain that were reigning while the various American colonies were being established. After the Declaration of Independence, the various U.S. presidents are shown instead, starting from George Washington and going all the way down to Donald Trump. The colors represent the different parties. Initially, the two parties that we know today didn't exist, but as we go down, we eventually get the familiar blue for Democrat and red for Republican. Note that due to space limitations, not every president's photo is shown, only those who served for more than 4 years. Next to the presidents and monarchs, we have a timeline of key events, including various wars, which are shown in red. And then in the middle, we have a line for every territory and state so that you can see how they all evolved over time. The dark red represents English or British colonies, the yellow, Spanish, the blue, French, and the green, the various Native American groups. And then after independence, the dark blue represents states and the gray areas represent territories. And all of these stars represent the order in which the states joined the Union. And you can see the foundation of various major cities are also shown. Now, I'm not the first person to make a chart like this. I actually got the idea from a much older chart made about 100 years ago by an individual named George Kruskup. And his chart goes horizontally, but is quite similar. It has the changing maps, it has the monarchs and presidents, and it has a line for each colony or state. But it only goes up until 1910 when this chart was published. So my own chart is sort of an updated, reimagined version of the older chart using a vertical format. If you're interested in getting a copy of it as a poster, it's available from my website, usefulcharts.com. Okay, now let's look at the maps. The first map is 1581. Now, obviously, the history of this land goes back much farther than this date, because by the time the Europeans arrived, the territory we now call the United States was already populated by hundreds of different Native American groups. Only few of the names of those groups are shown here. And these people had been living on the continent for at least 15,000 years. Let me show you a better map of what Native America looked like before the Europeans arrived. This is a map made by my friend Aaron Carapella. It lists all the various Native American groups and where they were located before the Europeans arrived. And the best thing about this map is that it uses the name of each group based on what they call themselves in their own native tongues, rather than the more commonly used names which often come from Europeans. So, for example, instead of Cherokee, it shows Ani-Yanuya. Aaron's website is tribalnationsmaps.com. I'll put that link in the description if you want to check that out. So in 1581, we have only one European settlement in what is today the continental United States, and that is the Spanish settlement of St. Augustine. It was established about 70 years after Christopher Columbus first landed on the continent. So although most people know the line, in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, it's important to remember that it was quite a long time after that the Europeans actually started to colonize what is now the United States. So let's jump ahead 40 years to 1621. And this is when the Europeans actually start to arrive. By this point, the Spanish had explored all the way up the Rio Grande River and had a settlement in Santa Fe, which is now in the state of New Mexico. And along the Atlantic seaboard, we have two English settlements, one down here in Jamestown, in what the English called Virginia, after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I, and one in Plymouth, close to Boston, in an area that became known as New England. In between these two colonies, we also had a Dutch settlement, Fort Nassau, and up on the St. Lawrence River, we have Quebec, a French settlement. And if we zoom ahead to 1661, we can see that all these initial colonies have begun to grow. The French are building more settlements along the St. Lawrence, as well as in Acadia, which is what we call Nova Scotia today. And the English still have two separate areas that they are developing, with the New Netherlands in the middle. And Spain is mostly down here in what is today Mexico. Now at this point, I feel it important to point out two very negative aspects of U.S. history. First is the fact that obviously all this European colonization was not good for the Native Americans. They were pushed off their lands, and many of them ended up dying from European diseases because they had no immunity to them. And this fact is not something that should be skipped over or forgotten. I think it's also important to remember that there are actually descendants of many of these groups still living in America today, and that their history and culture needs to be given the utmost respect and consideration when it comes to decision making that affects them. The second negative aspect of U.S. history is, of course, slavery, and that's shown over here. Between 1619 and 1859, almost 500,000 Africans were forced against their will to come to the American colonies and later to the various U.S. states to work the land. And this fact is also one that should not be skipped over or forgotten. Any history of the U.S. that does not include the history and experiences of African Americans is not complete. It's not just about slavery, but slavery is obviously a big part of the story. Okay, back to the maps. We are now at 1701. You can see that the Dutch are now gone, having been defeated by the English, and the English have now built settlements all along the Atlantic seaboard. New France has expanded into the Great Lakes, and the Spanish are still in Florida in this area here. If we move ahead to 1741, we can see that the French have now established themselves in Louisiana, which they named after their king, Louis XIV, and they're trading all along the Mississippi River. England is now Britain, and they've taken over Acadia from the French. And it's important to remember that several Native American groups still play an important role at this point, particularly the Iroquois in the north and the Cherokee in the south. Now, when we zoom ahead 40 years to 1781, we can see that a lot has changed. First of all, the French are gone, and that happened just before the Declaration of Independence. So let's actually go back to the previous map to explain. In a war known as the French and Indian War, Britain defeated France and became the sole power in the area. So not only did it control the 13 colonies, they also controlled the areas up here that were previously French. Just a decade after that happened, the 13 colonies revolted, declared independence, and fought against the British in the American Revolution. And the Americans won that war, so interestingly, the British were now basically confined to the area that was previously French, and that area became known as British North America. It was not Canada yet. A couple more things to point out. Vermont was not among the 13 colonies that signed the Declaration of Independence. They started out as their own republic, but then soon after joined the U.S. This area here was part of the original United States, but there were no actual states formed here yet. The area had originally been set aside by the British for the Native Americans, but eventually it would be settled by the Americans. You can see that Spain now controlled the former territory of Louisiana and are also starting to settle in California. And the only part of North America that has really not been claimed by any European country yet is this little corner up here, now Washington State and the province of British Columbia, which is where I happen to live. But it's important to remember that in 1781, although the Europeans claimed all this land, it was still mostly populated by Native Americans. In Canada, we use the term First Nations. Okay, let's look ahead to 1821. By now, 3 important things have happened. First, the United States has purchased Louisiana from the French. It had been Spanish, but then it briefly went back to France before France sold it to the U.S. Also, Florida is now part of the U.S., and Mexico has declared its independence from Spain. So Spain is no longer on the map. But look how big Mexico is. Mexico originally included California and Texas and all this area in between. Now, before we go to the next map, let's take a quick look at the timeline to show how the various states are forming. So originally there were 13 colonies, and these became the 13 states. They were quickly joined by Vermont. Some states were divided to form new states. So for example, part of Virginia was split off to form Kentucky, and part of Massachusetts was split off to form Maine. Other states were formed out of new territories that the U.S. was acquiring. So for example, let's look at the Louisiana Purchase. First, the area was unorganized, but then smaller territories would be carved out, and then these territories would eventually go on to become states. And of course, as this happened, the Native Americans continued to be pushed off their lands. You'll notice the Trail of Tears shown here. This was an event in which tens of thousands of Native Americans were forced to move halfway across the continent from their original lands to lands designated as Indian Territory further west. Let's go back to the maps. Moving forward to 1861, we come to one of the most important chapters in U.S. history, the Civil War. The Civil War was fought over the issue of slavery. The North no longer had slaves, but the South did, and they wanted to keep it that way. So the South actually broke away from the North and declared themselves to be a new country called the Confederate States of America. And this led to a civil war in which over 500,000 Americans died fighting each other. And when you see depictions of the Civil War, you can know that the soldiers wearing blue are from the North, and they were called Union soldiers, and the soldiers wearing gray are from the South, and they were called Confederate soldiers. So this war lasted about 4 years, and the North won, which meant 2 things. First of all, slavery was abolished in the South as well as the North. And 2, the United States was once again united. The breakaway states in the South rejoined the North. So you can see by 1901, the U.S. looks almost like it looks like today. The only exception is that Arizona and New Mexico and Oklahoma are still territories, not states. But that would soon change. Also, British North America is now Canada. So Canada is actually a younger country than the U.S. By 1941, we have 48 states on the continent. And in 1959, Alaska and Hawaii become states, making the current 50, which is why the American flag today has 50 stars on it. Here at the bottom, you can see which states have the largest populations, as well as which cities. Okay, that was just a very quick overview of U.S. history and how the territory evolved over time. If you're interested in getting this whole thing as a poster, you can head over to my website, usefulcharts.com. Thanks for watching.